This office building does not have an individual air conditioner for each room. Instead, it has one large air conditioner, which is part of a central air conditioning system. This is the outdoor unit where heat is released. Through the grill, you can see a large fan which blows air across the condenser coils. Inside the building, in this unit, are the cooling coils. A fan circulates air from the cooling coils up through the metal ductwork to the various rooms. In each room, there are two sets of vents. Near the floor are vents through which the cool air is blown into the room. As the cool air absorbs heat from the room, it becomes lighter and rises toward the ceiling. Having absorbed heat from the room, the air reaches another set of vents, where the air is drawn out of the room to be cooled once again. This animated drawing shows how the air circulates through the room. We call this process convection. Convection currents like these are also found in a room having an individual air conditioner. This is how warm air is brought to the air conditioner to be cooled and recirculated.
Hello, everyone. Welcome to Did You Know? The ESCO HVAC show. All right, today is going to be an interesting conversation. And so we should probably forewarn you right up front. This is not going to be political, but this is going to be very scientific, right? This is going to be another one of those topics that shows just exactly how amazing our industry is and how HVAC science can be used for life sciences, understanding the world around us and understanding the consequences of change. But because of all of the science that comes into our field, we have a very unique perspective of understanding things like weather. You go, weather? Like how do we understand weather? Wow. Jason, we could spend hours talking about weather. Wait till you get Eugene Silverstein on here talking about weather, and he's talking about, well, how is there moisture in the sky? How is it lighter than the rest of the air around it? Isn't it heavier? And you go, wait a minute, let's get the psychrometric chart out and let's start looking at the mass of atoms and molecules. That's a whole nother story. But today, we're spending time with Jason Obrzut. How are you, my friend?
Hello, everyone. Welcome to the show.
You know, Jason brought this topic to me. Let's see. It was about a little over a month ago, I guess. It was when I was headed down to AHR. So I was on my way from the Tallahassee Danfoss Turbo Core facility, and Jason called me, and I was driving. He's like, dude, all right, think about this for a minute, right? We always talk about dry bulb. Have you ever thought about how wet bulb can actually determine the non-existence of life? Hey, Eugene is here with us. Thank you. Oh, Eugene, I should have invited you on this. I thought you would really be a good part about this. So maybe Jason and I will introduce this. We'll take it from the 1,000 foot down to like a 500 or a 300 foot view. And then we can do a part 2 and you can bring it the rest of the way home. Hey, Kendrick, thanks for joining us. I think you're really going to like this, Kendrick. This one's, man, this is one of those things that if you bring this into the classroom, some of the kids are going to be like, that's cool. And then other kids are going to go like, that's scary. And then you bring your administrators in and they're going to go, you teach this kind of stuff in your classroom? And we go, yeah. Yes,
there's a lot to this. You brought up weather. I mean, one of the reasons we have to condition the spaces that we live in, again, is because of weather, depending on where you're at. If you're in Arizona, you're cooling. If you're right now where I'm at, we're heating. But we're consistently having to condition the spaces that we occupy because of, again, the weather that you referenced earlier.
Yeah, and definitely everyone that's joining us, let us know where you're chiming in from, especially if you're from other places around the world, because this is going to hopefully it's going to make sense to everyone. But it's a very different topic for us. And I actually had a conversation yesterday with a gentleman that was a IT engineer that was joining us. Adrian, thanks for joining us in from Arizona. Man, this one's really going to hit home with you when we start talking about your climate. And yeah, this is right up your alley. And so I was talking to him and he's like, I love your show because I have learned so much about the science of HVAC just from watching your show. I'm not from the HVAC background. I am from IT, and I'm a numbers and algorithms kind of person, but you all help this make sense, and it's just absolutely fascinating. And so we hope that you all do enjoy that. Paul, thank you for joining us. So, all right, Jason, today, now, everyone, we're not here to scare you. We're here to use science to understand human existence and the limits of existence that can actually be measured. And this was just such a crazy perspective when we got here. Eugene down in Westlake. All right. Okay. So we always talk about dry bulb temperatures, Jason.
It's one of the things where when we talk about, the planet's heating up or the climate's warming up, whatever, we're always, when we say that, we're talking about dry bulb. All right. But there's something else that we should really be looking at, and that is the wet bulb.
Sure. And Joe, I've even seen articles you talking about things like this before, especially in the refrigeration world. We take measurements of dry bulb and wet bulb for calculations, but a lot of people don't exactly understand what we're doing with wet bulb. And then when you start looking at wet bulb being a measurement of potentially the death of all of us, like an actual number that can be measured, it changes the way that you look at atmosphere, and it also changes the way you look at, say, things like perspiration, right? Which is a factor of a rate of moving heat. Not that we're just moving heat, it's a rate of moving. So Jason, let's dive a little bit into wet bulb, and then we're going to transition into a way that we use wet bulb to compare different climates around the world. And it can be used for any world as far as that goes. We could actually use this information to measure the ability to sustain life even on other planets, right?
So one of the things that you had brought up is, again, through the climate, our own existence, that sort of thing, there are limits in place. Right. The human body does have limits. When we're doing air conditioning, when we're conditioning the air, removing heat, removing humidity, lowering the wet bulb, we're allowing our bodies to function better. We're improving comfort. However, we can't do this outside. The outside, the climate outside is the climate, and we're going to have to live in it.
That's right.
And there are certain conditions where we can't, even if you're stepping into the shade, you can't exist out there. We can continue to condition, again, the spaces that we occupy. But as soon as you walk outside, there are limits to what we can and can't do as a human species.
Exactly. And our core body temperature really is a driving factor of temperature regulation, right? We are constantly producing heat internally. And so we regulate that temperature. So when we think about dry bulb, we're talking about that temperature of the air and we're not really talking about the effect of moisture on it. We're just talking about that temperature outside, right? So if we talk about dry bulb temperature, we have a really, really wide range that humans can survive in. Right? With the right clothing, we can be down in, minus 30, minus 40, minus 50 degrees Fahrenheit and still be able to survive. We can be in 100 degrees, 110, 120. We've even had humans that have been able to survive for very short periods of time in that 140 degree dry bulb temperature. Now, when we start factoring in something like wet bulb, that great big range of human survival comes down to a very, very small window. And we're going to show you that window later. So you'll definitely want to stay around for that last slide because it will show you exactly where those ranges are. So, all right, dry bulb, thermometer, outside reads the temperature, right? So we're just talking about Adrian out there in Arizona, right? Gets really, really hot. Might be a dry heat. Right?
Yeah, that's what we always say. 400 degrees in an oven's a dry heat too, but the turkey really does mind it.
No, it does not like it at all. It tends to change its state of matter every once in a while. Right? Go from solid to liquid and from solid to vapor. All right. So if we were to take that same thermometer, hey, Marco, glad that you're joining us from Boston. If we take that same thermometer and we start putting into account the rate at which heat can move, we start looking at how moisture controls heat movement. All right, so if we took that same thermometer and we introduced it into a wet environment, we're going to start having that evaporative cooling effect. Okay. We're going to start evaporating water out of that substance that's connected now or touching the surface of our thermometer. And as that water is being evaporative cooling into the atmosphere, it's removing heat with it at a certain rate. And it actually changes the temperature on a thermometer. I'll show you here in just a second what that looks like. So evaporative cooling is a rate of heat transfer. And that's what our wet bulb is actually measuring. It's measuring how the temperature change is being affected in a rate because of moisture around it. Okay, so a change in moisture should change the rate of heat transfer. And that really is the principle behind wet bulb measuring. Now, we've got dry bulb. We've attached moisture to it to measure the rate of change to get a wet bulb. But what about, like, is it different when I'm in direct sunlight, Jason, versus in the shade?
If we're measuring dry bulb, yes, it's going to be a significant difference. However, when we're measuring wet bulb, the wet bulb is the wet bulb.
That's right. So we've started using a new calculation, and it's becoming a very common term around the world, even here on our local news. It's called wet bulb globe temperature. You may see it as wet bulb global temperature, but typically it's just WBGT, wet bulb globe temperature. So now we're going to take into effect dry bulb, wet bulb, radiant heat, and wind. We're going to talk about the movement of that heat. And now we're going to come up with a temperature that can be used to compare the environment around us globally and in other worlds potentially. It gives us a way to understand how our human body is affected by the environment around us, that rate that we can control the heat within our body. And this just gets fascinating.
Clifton, real quick, back to that second slide there. One of the reasons in air conditioning, if you will, cooling, that we're looking at wet bulb again, because the wet bulb will directly affect how our body can cool itself down, because the body's mechanism for cooling is sweating. And a lot of folks think that the sweating is the moisture on your skin, and think that is not what cools you.
That's right.
When that sweat evaporates, as you mentioned earlier, that heat transfer, it's the sweat evaporating that carries the heat away from you.
That evaporative cooling.
And if the air is already saturated, it's full. If we have a very high wet bulb, we have a very slow rate of evaporation. It slows down the body's ability to cool itself. So just because you have sweat on you doesn't mean your body is cooling properly. That sweat needs to then evaporate from your body to carry the heat away with it. And if that evaporation isn't happening, then the cooling isn't happening.
So if we think about that moisture content that's already in the air, the higher that wet bulb, you're right, the slower heat is rejected from our body. And to a point, there's actually a point that we're going to show you here in a little bit at which our body actually starts shutting off perspiration. And you go, well, why would it do that? Well, if it gets to a point where it cannot control and regulate the temperature internally, and the temperature continues to rise, it's actually going to try to shut us down before we kill the brain.
Conserve resources, so to speak, conserve water, conserve,
and start reducing the heat generating components within us.
And we organs. As people don't, this is a natural thing that the body does. We don't have control over it. It's a natural reaction to our environment, to what's around us.
It's amazing. It is a natural hygrometer to control our thermometer. And I thought, when I first started thinking about that, I was like, oh my, okay, we have to do a show on this. Katie, thanks for joining us today. Yeah, Katie, I got to get with you too here real soon, because I'm anxious to get you on the show and start having those conversations. All right, let's briefly talk about that effect of wet bulb on a dry bulb reading, right? So now that we understand that it is a matter of looking at the rate that heat is being evaporated out of that water. If we took our thermometer and we put it out here on, say, a 100-degree day, right? Say say, Adrian, we're out at your house. It's 100 degrees. Heck, that could be spring for you. We walk outside and it's 100 degrees on our dry bulb. Oh, yeah, Murph? Huh. Yes. That's kind of what we're getting into as well.
There's going to be a point, right,
Mhm.
where no matter what, even if you do have air flowing, if there's a specific amount of moisture in the air and the wet bulb is high enough, even airflow is not going to assist in any evaporation because the air is full, so to speak.
Yeah,
Can't
it
receive
hits
any more.
an equilibrium where it
Right.
can no longer perform.
So when we think of heat transfer, the greater the difference in temperature, the more
The
heat
faster the
we
rate.
can try.
Yeah.
So if we have a moisture content that is similar to the moisture content of the air, there's not going to be this exchange anymore.
That's exactly right. So I put this one together today, and I hope that it helps explain a little bit. I shot it over to Jason. He's like, "What in the heck are you trying to do here?" And I'm like, "Okay, well, I'm trying to talk about rate." And so then when I told him it was about rate of which wet bulb changes the heat, he's like, "Oh, okay, that kind of makes sense." So all right, so Adrian, we've walked outside. It's out 100 degrees outside in the desert, and we read a 100 degrees. Okay, if we were to take a sponge, a dry sponge, soak that in water, put it on the bulb of that thermometer, because you have such low relative humidity. I need to change that. That's relative humidity. Say you've got 5% relative humidity out there in the desert. That wet sponge is going to evaporate that water very quickly, which means it's going to absorb heat very quickly. And so it's going to bring our dry bulb thermometer temperature down. And so that now is our wet bulb reading. It's because it did it fast. It drew a lot of heat out of our thermometer because it was evaporating it into water. Because the air around it didn't have much water in it. So it could do it very quickly. All right, let's move over to Katie over in St. Louis. 40% relative humidity. That's pretty fair, right? That's a spring relative humidity. So if we took the same sponge, we absorbed it in water, we put it on that same, it's 100 degrees outside on the dry bulb, we put that same sponge on, you're not going to get that same 60 degree that Adrian was reading on his wet bulb, because you have more humidity in the air around you than Adrian did. Therefore, the moisture in the sponge is going to evaporate slower because it's trying to fill in those spaces in the air that Eugene would be happy to tell you about, all the moisture in the air and where it goes and the nitrogen. So, it's trying to move these molecules. And so because it doesn't have as much space to fill, it does it slower. So the temperature on that thermometer is going to come down slower, not going to go as far. So you would actually end up reading, like, say, around 80 degrees on your wet bulb because it wasn't moving it as fast. So I hope that kind of comes together and makes sense to you all.
For the sciencey folks out there, you can get this information on a psychrometric chart, which
you betcha.
Yes,
where this came from.
Right.
So, I borrowed this right off Eugene's psychrometric chart and trying to get better at it. And so this is where the numbers come from. And another thing you'll hear us talking about every once in a while too is like wet bulb depression. Literally, that is just that change from where was my dry bulb and then where did I end up when I put my sponge on it. That is your depression, that difference. Okay, that could probably be a show right there. Just diving into that. All right, so now we understand that it's a rate, okay? Does that make sense, Murph? It did for me. When I seen it that way, I was like, oh yeah. So there you go, right? Talk about how AC, can change that speed at which we're evaporating. All right, yeah, we're just changing that temperature. Okay, so let's take that concept. Now let's move a little forward. This is where it starts getting interesting. We all know heat index, right? We always talk about what's a heat index, especially when it gets hot in the summertime. All right. Heat index is a relationship with that wet bulb. But if we factor in the true dry bulb, the true wet bulb, the intensity of the sun, and the speed of air moving, we can come up with a more accurate reference called the wet bulb globe temperature.
There's a lot. If you look at that chart, there's a lot that goes into that. It uses cloud cover, sun angle. It uses a lot of different things to come up with that temperature. So it's looking at all of the climatic conditions that exist around you.
Exactly. So in the past where we had dry bulb and wet bulb, now because of the speed of calculations and the amount of information that we have, we can calculate these numbers extremely fast.
We have some accurate instruments for doing it as well now, whereas back in the day we were swinging tubes of mercury around the living room with a wet sock on it. Today we're a little more advanced. Yeah.
And hopefully we're using actually distilled water, not something right out of the tap that had minerals on it that weighed it down and slowed it down. But that's a whole nother story. All right. So if we add all these additional factors, we come up with this thing called wet bulb global temperature. People are probably by now going, yeah, that's all neat and scientific, but where are we actually using that? Well, the reason I wanted for us to dive into this is because we are absolutely starting to use this. So remember, we're taking air temperature, dry bulb, we're taking wet bulb, we're taking this globe temperature. We have this actual number now that will give us the environmental effect on our body. It helps us understand the rate of heat movement away from us. And we are already starting to see internationally, news stations are starting to use wet bulb globe temperature because of its accuracy and to understand how it affects us. All right. So this one is just News 13. It's got a range in there. We're going to dive into that range a little bit deeper. But the understanding what that wet bulb globe temperature means to us and the rate at which heat is exhausted from our body tells us how long we can survive in an area. All right. And it also tells us at what point we cannot even survive in that area. And there's a number to that.
There is. And it can be dependent on your health, but there is a number that no matter how in physical shape you are, there's a number that just can't be exceeded.
That's right. But Eugene, they're kind of fun when they do fall. Then you can play with them. All right. So there's one example. So there's News 13. Here's News 12 Storm Tracker showing exactly that same style of chart that we were doing again. So you're starting to see news channels helping people understand, especially as we start getting into extreme weather circumstances, because remember that wet bulb temperature changes once our barometric pressure changes. And so as a temperature goes up and that wet bulb goes up, our recalculated wet bulb globe temperature becomes very critical to understand, right? So here's another one. That's that Storm Tracker 13. Here's another one that I found out there. I guess that was another one on Storm 12. So it's comparing that heat index that we used to look at, right, versus what wet bulb globe temperature actually is.
What I do want to point out here is that heat index looks high at like 102. And then when you look at the wet bulb globe temperature, it's it's only 84 or 89. That's not too, but we can, there's, when we break out the ranges later, you'll understand why that 89 is really serious.
Yeah, it's critical because we would think of 89 as not being a crucial number. You're going to start understanding exactly what that effect looks like. So there's another one, News 41, showing how we're utilizing those additional measurements. And that one was
they're using it to assign risk levels for outdoor activity, which again in our industry there's quite a bit of, especially spring, summer, fall, where we're working outdoors or in attics. This becomes a serious issue.
Well, in the past we've always talked about like heat stroke and heat exhaustion based on our dry bulb temperature. Well, when you understand it from this aspect, it'll all make sense of why the lower temperatures can actually cause more serious conditions than what we used to think of as just the highest temperatures.
So we've been taking wet bulb temperatures in the house or in whatever space we're conditioning to understand heat load, to understand comfort conditions, and we're trying to create this space where human occupants feel comfortable indoors. Again, we can condition this, but understanding it outside, doing it again, we can't condition the weather outside. The climate outside is the climate, and we're going to have to deal with it. We have no, it is what it is, and we need to understand what it is we're stepping out into. When we have this nice air-conditioned home where the humidity is low, the wet bulb is low, and then we step outside and there's this shock to the body, there's nothing you can do about that but be prepared for it.
Right, and that's what this does. So this entire training that we're doing today will help you be able to assess all conditions anywhere in the world with the same comparisons so that we know exactly where our health standard is for being able to survive, right? So if we look at that wet bulb, remember, this is just kind of a recap. When we're talking about that wet bulb, when we're measuring the air, if it's drier outside, we can evaporate it faster. When it's latent with moisture, it's slower. But this is so critical when we're talking about controlling our internal temperature. Because now if we look at that lower the wet bulb, the easier we can control our internal temperature. The higher the wet bulb, the more difficult we're going to be able to control our internal temperature. And now let's start talking about the limits. Yeah. And at the end, I break this down on a visual to let it look a little bit more.
So most of your
linear.
Scientists are going to agree. Again, 99% of them are going to tell you that at a 95-degree wet bulb, the human sweat mechanism no longer functions. And again, that's in a healthy, in shape, hydrated person. It can be as low as 86 in certain areas, depending on your health and how well you're hydrated. But 95 is the limit. If we reach or exceed that, no matter if you're in the shade, no matter if there's wind blowing, no matter what is going on, there can be no cooling of the human body at that wet bulb. And as you show in the slide here, we've reached this temperature at numerous places on the planet in the past few years.
Yeah, I actually found a very intriguing video. This is 5 minutes long, so hang out with us, right? This is going to take an additional 5 minutes, but this is a really interesting video explanation of what we're talking about, and then we're going to dive even deeper into it after the video. So hang on, and we'll see you in 5.
There's a temperature threshold beyond which the human body simply can't survive. A threshold that some parts of the world are increasingly starting to cross. It's a wet bulb temperature of 95 degrees Fahrenheit. Let's unpack what that means, starting with the number, 95. It has to do with our human body temperature. The human body needs to be right around 98.6 degrees Fahrenheit. If our body temperature gets too high or too low, bad things can happen. Our bodies are always giving off heat from normal functions like digesting, thinking, and pumping blood. If it were to get above 95 degrees Fahrenheit outside, our body heat just wouldn't have anywhere to go. That's why our bodies have a built-in cooling system: sweat. Sweat works by using a physics hack called evaporative cooling. It takes quite a bit of heat to turn water from a liquid to a gas. So as little droplets of sweat leave our skin, they pull a lot of heat away from our bodies. When the air is really dry, a little bit of sweat can cool us down a lot. But humid air, on the other hand, already contains a lot of water vapor, which makes it harder for sweat to evaporate, and we can't cool down as well. This is where the term wet bulb temperature comes in. It's a measure of heat and humidity, essentially the temperature we experience after sweat cools us off. We can measure the wet bulb temperature by sticking a damp little sleeve on the end of a thermometer and spinning it around. Water evaporates from the sock, cooling down the thermometer. If it's humid, it hardly cools down at all, and if the air is dry, it cools down a lot. That final reading after it's cooled down is the wet bulb temperature. In Death Valley, one of the hottest places on Earth, temperatures often get up to 120 degrees Fahrenheit. But the air is so dry that it actually only registers a wet bulb temperature of 77 degrees. At the same time, a humid state like Florida could reach that same wet bulb temperature on a muggy 86-degree day. And when the wet bulb temperature gets above 95 degrees Fahrenheit, the body loses its ability to cool down, and the consequences can be deadly. Until recently, scientists didn't think we'd crossed this threshold outside of doomsday climate change scenarios. But a 2020 study looking at detailed weather records around the world found we've already crossed it, at least 14 times in the last 40 years. These hot, humid events have all been clustered in two regions, Pakistan and the Arabian Peninsula. The warm water in the Red Sea and the Persian Gulf makes the air above extremely humid. Inland on the Arabian Peninsula, the arid continental heat causes temperatures to skyrocket. And when these two systems meet, they can tip the wet bulb temperatures above that 95-degree threshold. In Pakistan, it's a little less clear what's driving these hot, humid extremes. But scientists think it's caused by warm, humid air flowing inland during the monsoon season. As the air passes over the Indus River, it only gets more humid, until it hits cities like Jacobabad, often referred to as one of the hottest cities on Earth. Jacobabad has crossed that deadly wet bulb threshold a whopping 6 times, the most of any single city on record. If we plot all these events over time, it's clear these hot, humid extremes are increasing as the planet warms. Scientists expect these events to occur even more frequently in these regions going forward. And other places like coastal Mexico and a larger portion of South Asia might soon be at risk of crossing these thresholds for the first time. Extreme heat is deadly at temperatures well below the 95-degree threshold. Healthy young adults can experience serious health effects at a wet bulb temperature of 86 degrees. And even dry heat can be dangerous when people's bodies simply can't pump out sweat fast enough to cool themselves. With every degree of warming, we're making these dangerous heat events even more likely. And stopping climate change may be our best chance to keep these events as rare as possible.
So a very good explanation of exactly what we're talking about.
So I will point out that since that video has been made, those temperatures have been recorded in Uruguay, Mexico, Australia, Mexico. So there's a ton of places that those temperatures have been crossed already outside of just that little region.
And that video is 2 years old, right? So we are passing these barriers that we didn't expect to pass. The 95-degree Fahrenheit was a theoretical point until this last decade. And so now we are starting to track it. We're realizing that that theoretical point is continuing to progress. We're starting to get higher and higher wet bulb globe temperatures, which is why it's become so important for us to look at and to understand. So when we look at this, here was one of those reports, Jason found this. We're not talking about just 95, right? We actually, our highest so far is 97.34, which means the human body cannot survive. Once we hit the 95 degree, our body stops sweating. And if we cannot get to a place where we can reduce that temperature, where our body is going to continue, because remember, our body is continuing to produce heat. The body starts shutting down. It does that by shutting off organs that are producing heat. And the last thing to shut off is the brain, right? It's a protective system to keep us from hitting that 95-degree point. But now that we are beginning to exceed that point, it's crucial to understand who is at threat and how.
Real quick, 2 points in that video. The other point was that we could look at wet bulb temperature as the maximum temperature through sweating that the body could theoretically reach. Wet bulb temperature and sweat, cooling through sweat and evaporation are like the same thing. So if you look at a wet bulb that's 95, that means your body can cool no further below than 95, right? So you can look at those two things as interrelated, that the wet bulb and the sweat mechanism are directly related. Whatever your wet bulb is, that's the coolest temperature through sweating that your body could reach.
Yes, absolutely. And you're right. The elevation changes that. That's why we take in all of these factors to create that wet bulb globe temperature, so that no matter where you are in the world or other worlds, we can now understand the human body and how it is regulating its temperature. So let's now look at who all is affected by this, right? Hey, thanks for joining us, Mr. Tebby, down in Louisiana. All right. So when we look at those that are threatened, it's most mammals. And sadly, there are bird species that are actually affected the same way at 92 degrees wet bulb. So as we continue to warm, as our continued escalation of heat and humidity, we will actually see species that can no longer fly at 92 degrees. They will actually have to be grounded, and they will start going through the same processes that we will at 95 degrees. They're doing
So
that
we
at
don't think about
92.
that a lot. Like, okay, so when it's hot
No.
like that and the wet bulb is really high, you and I will step into a place, you know, that is conditioned. What do we do with the animals? Like, yeah, horses and
Heat.
cows and things. I mean, there's some of the things in the food chain there, the supply chain, that are going to directly be affected as well. What the other thing
That's
that
right.
it shows is that you don't necessarily have to have an insanely high dry bulb to get a high wet bulb. All right. So
No.
when we talk about a warming plant and all this, that everyone's focusing on that dry, what was 135? But as you saw in Death Valley, the wet bulb was only 77. So it doesn't necessarily, it's not directly related that we can end up with a 95 degree dry bulb and a 95 degree wet bulb, depending on the moisture content. So they are not directly a link, so to speak. We need to focus more on the wet
No,
bulb than the dry bulb. Yes.
the wet
Because
bulb.
again, that's where,
Absolutely. It completely
yeah.
takes the dry bulb out. As far as our ability to survive. And
If you had a
regulate the body
130
temperature.
degree dry bulb and you had a fan, you could cool down, or step into the shade, you could cool down. But if the wet bulb was 95, you couldn't do anything to cool down. Not a thing.
Exactly. And so we use a variety of different tools to measure that. Some of you are familiar with all of these, right? They're different ones. Osvaldo, yeah, you've got water. Water's great until it reaches 95 degrees, and then we got a problem. So we use a variety of tools to measure that. I particularly have that field piece. It's in the pouch right now, but I've carried mine for about 10 years. I like to look at my environment to know what my condition is. And that wet bulb is now becoming more important for me to understand. So we use the psychrometric chart to be able to look at that. And so if we're looking at our dry bulb, which we know runs across the bottom of the chart, we bring up on these angled, which are going to be our relative humidity. We can actually plot those, but modern tools gives us that opportunity to just measure that. We do have a poster that I'll be releasing here really soon. This is the ESCO psychrometric chart poster with a link to a video with Eugene where we dive into explaining
I was going to
that
say, this
as
is
well.
like
So
Eugene's wheelhouse. Like, he does the stuff in his sleep. He could plot stuff on this chart with his eyes
Yes.
closed and like throw darts and say, okay, that's exactly. Yeah. I mean,
That's
it
right.
is.
It's going to go
Yes, he
there.
is good like that.
He absolutely is. So if anyone's looking for that for their classroom, let us know. Like I said, that we'll be printing these and releasing these in the near future. If I had some requests for them, I'll move that up on the print cycle as well. So you'll start seeing a lot more of these graphs being utilized for human health conditions. And this is just a replotting of that exact same thing that we've seen on the psychrometric chart to show you where that lines up. So like Jason was saying, we could have a 100, remember looking dry bulb across the top, relative humidity across the left. We could have that 100 degree day, but if I have a 45% relative humidity on that day, I'm not going to be able to cool myself at all. And so this humidity is causing more of an impact to human capacity than
To be
that dry
outside
bulb.
anyway,
We
right?
used to
Yeah.
think, exactly. I used to think, oh, it keeps getting hotter. Yeah, it keeps getting hotter. At what point is it going to hurt us? And we've always said, well, yeah, it's a dry heat, it's wet heat, it's very different. Well, now we can understand what that difference is because we can compare any of them. It doesn't matter. We can use the wet bulb calculation to know exactly where that point of exhaustion is. We could do 122 degrees on a dry bulb day if there was less than 5% relative humidity. But at the same token, it could be an 82.4 degree dry bulb day at 100% humidity. I'm sorry, 86 degree day with a 100% relative humidity, and I will barely be able to maintain. Soon as I move past 86, I hit 87 degrees at 100% humidity. It's the same as 122 out in the desert. That's pretty drastic to look at from that comparison.
This is why we should
so we've got a
be
couple different
looking,
ones.
again, when we're working on a comfort cooling system of some sort and we're trying to get the space to comfort levels. We should have been looking at wet bulb already. This is the reason.
The whole
One of the
time.
reasons is because it directly affects human comfort. Again, we're trying to maintain a specific window there. But
Yeah.
we should, again, this relates to air conditioning, in that this is one of the things we look at when we're tuning up an air conditioner or charging an air conditioner or checking airflow. We're looking at this wet bulb. We should be, again, because of the effects that it has on the occupants of that space.
Jason, it's a perfect example of why is this oversized air conditioner that is running at 68 degrees uncomfortable? It's because of the wet bulb calculation. So when we're looking at this wet bulb globe temperature has now been adopted by all outdoor sports. If you go to horse racing, they're using this exact same chart. If you go through any high school or collegiate sports, we're all using this, right? So when we're looking at that globe temperature, if we look at let's look at the 76.9 degree, they're not white, right? That gives us the amount of work that we can actually do. We're looking at this, how many BTUs am I producing versus how many BTUs can I get rid of, right? In the environment that I am in. Yeah, Eugene, you're so true, right? When I get hot, don't do anything. That's the only way to cool down. But as we start increasing that, we're now going to see things like this. So this is the one that's actually been utilized for sports. So sports are now doing this measurement, because remember, used to, it was a measure of dry bulb. Dry bulb determined when sports would stop. Well, now that we understand the effect of wet bulb, it's all changed. And so our sports are being monitored and measured by wet bulb globe temperature now. So once we exceed that 88.9, once we hit 89 degrees, exercise is forbidden. There cannot be sports activity once we've reached that 89, because we're getting too close to that 95. So if we look at that great big window that we can survive in dry bulb based on the clothing that we wear, it's very significant. But when we look at the wet bulb temperature, we have a very, very short range.
For existence, yes. Without some sort of conditioning or some sort of mechanical cooling or something, that range is pretty small.
Yeah. So this is our internal body temperature. And once I started looking at those numbers, so I put this together so we had a reference of what that actually looks like for our internal temperatures, right? So most of us are in that average range of 98.6 to 99.5, even during work and exercise, right? That is the operating window. Think about that. That is less than 1 degree Fahrenheit that most of us operate worldwide based on wet bulb temperature. If I was to drop below that, if I only went down to 95 degrees, 3.5 degrees lower than the average body temperature, I'm a 98.7, so 3.7. If I drop to 95
Your
degrees
core
internal
temperature, right?
wet bulb, internal core temperature, I'm now going to be in that mode of hypothermia. At 86, I lose consciousness. And at 82.4 is death. And so we think about that. It's like, really? Can I die at 82 degrees? Yeah, absolutely. If that's all that our internal temperature could do, if we were producing heat faster than we could control it, like if our heat is escaping faster than our internal heat generating can maintain, and our internal temperature gets below 82.4, that's the end of us. Now let's go the other direction. We've all experienced fevers. We all know that the higher the fever, the more pain that it is, and the more confusion that is set in. That is because once we start approaching that point, once we have started approaching that 100 degree, our body is now regulating its temperature even faster. It's trying to control that internal temperature. We're sweating. The higher we get, we're sweating profusely. We're trying to remove the heat internal, because if that internal temperature reaches 107, That is our highest parameter as well. But think about that. Think about that short window between 82.4 and 107. That's our internal range. So when we start utilizing the wet bulb temperature of the environment around us, it gives us the opportunity to understand where we can survive because of this very short window of our internal operating temperature. And once Jason brought that up and I started researching, I was like, this is the most important thing I think I've ever learned about myself and
you see how
survival.
small it is.
I mean,
you don't realize how little that window is. When they say like, oh, the planet Earth is the best place to live, it is the only place a lot of people don't realize that like 96% of the species on this planet are already extinct, and we have this little window, this little 107, 80,
less than 15
window
degrees.
that our core temperature, and we can exist in that temperature.
And so understanding that wet bulb temperature and wet bulb globe temperature is an absolute must for everyone, and be able to teach it in the class comfortably. What wet bulb temperature
Why do we
is
look
doing.
at it? Right.
It is
Not
why
just
do we
what
look
is
at
it, but why is it so important?
Yeah.
Why are we looking at it? It directly affects
All right,
the
everyone.
way our body cools. And if we begin to affect that, we begin to slowly, as you get a fever, the temperature, we can't regulate it. We start. One of the things that was in that other chart is water intake, because there's only so much water you can sweat out before you run out of it. You become severely dehydrated.
Right.
So when we, even in higher wet bulb temperatures where your sweat mechanism is working to keep you cool, if you don't replace the water that was lost from your body, you're not going to have anything to sweat anymore anyway.
Right. We're going to remove that potential for that evaporative cooling effect. All right. Have we scared everyone? It scared me.
It's an eye-opener for sure.
When we go back to that one diagram with the species that are affected by a 95-degree wet bulb temperature, that's just
those
a short
are all
list.
species that sweat to stay cool.
Exactly. And so when we start looking at animals that sweat, mammals that sweat, that have the same regulating function that we do, they're all driven by approximately a 95-degree balance point. And when we look at it from that perspective, that wet bulb globe temperature, that 95-degree, is actually our balance point of survival.
And one of the comments I get is, well, that's way far away from here. Those are places that are so far away. I'm going to tell you something. There are millions, possibly billions of people that live in those areas that are going to have to relocate if those become the norm. And where are they going to relocate to? Right here. They're going to have to move north right now.
Yeah.
You're going to see mass moving around to try and avoid these temperatures.
You know, the unfortunate deaths of people that have died in migrations around the world just in the last few years. You know, there have been a lot of analysis as to why people were dying in 100 and 105 degree weather. And if you look at that from a dry arid perspective, you could travel a fair distance at 100 degrees if it is dry. But we start adding that humidity to it and our wet bulb temperature goes up. All we have to do is approach that 95-degree wet bulb, and that is the point at which our body starts shutting us down.
For most people, again, if you're not hydrated, if you're not in good shape, if you have health issues, that 95 is all the way down to 86. Yeah.
Exactly.
That 95 is, again, for everybody indefinitely, but the further out of shape you are, like if you have diabetes or if you're drinking soda instead of water, things like that, then it's going to happen a lot lower.
Right. And it's scary to think about, but it is an actual number that can be measured. It's a reference point that you're going to start seeing in a lot of news broadcast. I had not even recognized it until Jason brought this to my attention. Then when I started searching for news stations that were utilizing wet bulb globe temperature and wet bulb temperature to give you a prediction of activities of the day, then I thought, okay, this is getting serious. We are starting to use this. We are approaching this. We are hitting this. and this is the number to avoid. I mean, this is your maximum, but all those numbers gives you an idea of how much exertion we can do and in the environment that we're at, wherever we're at.
And we look at, from an air conditioning technician side, we're conditioning, again, the inside air. We don't have any control over the temperature. It is what it is. So we know where we can exist and where we can't. And the more this starts to happen, the fewer places there are for us to exist as a species. Right. And it affects the food chain as well. As you saw on the one slide, there's quite a few animals and things. And how often do you bring them into a climate controlled area?
Right. And we always think of, our environment, but now we have to be, very concerned about the world that we live in. So, we're not trying to raise this as a global warming perspective. We can all agree that our summers are getting a little warmer and a little humider, whatever kind of cycle they're on. We can absolutely agree. In that sparks a lot of different weather patterns. We had very significant weather pattern here in Indiana last night. I had a F2 tornado touch down less than a mile from my house, did a lot of damage here in Brownsburg. We had 7 of them at least that we're tracking around the state. Very significant difference than what we, seen 10, 20 years ago here in the area. But the thing that I noticed the most after Jason and I had this conversation, I started putting this PowerPoint together, preparing for this class. When I opened the door, the slider to go see what was going outside before we started getting to any of our warnings, open the slider, and immediately my wife's like, oh, I can't hardly breathe. It's so hot and humid out there. And I went, it's because of our wet bulb temperature. She said, what temperature? I said, the wet bulb temperature. And so I look over at my thermometer and, I'm actually calculating humidity and I can see it going up, but it's not doing actual calculated wet bulb. So I am going to be looking for a new weather station that calculates wet bulb.
It's something that we need to be aware of moving forward. Instead of continuing to drive the focus on dry bulb, we need to drive the focus to be more on that wet bulb and that global wet bulb temperature as well. It's going to impact us a lot sooner than a dry bulb will.
Yeah. Once we started seeing how many places around the world and even here in the United States have already been surpassing that 95-degree wet bulb, it really makes you think about the environment that we live in.
And where we live.
Yeah. Let alone how we use wet bulb to base the comfort level of our interior space. If we start rethinking, like, what is the right temperature? What's a comfortable temperature in a space? We always use, no, it's based on your wet bulb temperature.
The two things that you do when you're checking the chart, calculating superheat, you're doing your wet bulb and your dry bulb.
It's part of the calculation that we never looked at as a critical part of that comfort.
And if you're not doing it, you really should be. And this is why. It has a serious effect on human comfort, both indoors and outdoors. We can control what it is indoors, but we can't control what it is outside.
Absolutely. Boy.
And it's going to be, thrown upon us, the technicians, us in the HVAC industry, to create these areas where we can go to be comfortable. As these temperatures start to become the norm, there's going to have to be spaces where we are comfortable, where we can exist indoors with decent wet bulbs and dry bulbs.
Exactly. Howard, I'm going to have you on the show to help explain that one for me. We'll dive deeper into that one. All right. That's a lot of deep information. I probably will go deeper than this some other time. I'll have Eugene join us and we'll talk about what happens to that air, especially when we're looking at that relative humidity and, why is there a change in the speed or the rate at which we move moisture into the air, and what happens with other molecules that's in that space, and what does it do for pressure? There's a whole nother layer that we can dive into that I think would be enjoyable sometime if that's something that you're interested in. And I really want to know what you think about the shows, how deep you want to go into this. Please give us some input. Let me know if this is as far as we go, or do we go deeper than this on another episode? Let us know other topics that you want to learn more about, because we're really enjoying diving into some of these topics that we don't always talk about in our industry. I was always taught to take that wet bulb measurement.
And that's it.
I knew how I was getting it, but I didn't really know what it means. Oh, all right. If you're interested, my friend, we're going to go there. So Eugene's out here with us still. So Eugene, I'm going to have to get with you. So in the near future, we'll have to do a atmospheric class of, what's happening with this change of wet bulb temperature. How does it affect the air around us? And how do we use the psychrometric chart and having the tools like Psychrometrics Without Tears to be able to learn and explain that? I think that'd be a very good conversation for us to have.
It's an important topic. Again, the
It is.
humidity, the wet bulb psychrometrics is a really, it's going to be coming more and more mainstream. Right now, we talk about, psychrometrics. Oof. The chart, you mean? Yeah, the chart.
Air?
Yeah. Right.
I need to know about air.
And
it's fascinating.
We should have been doing it this whole time, and you can see why. It wasn't as pressing 20, 30 years ago because we weren't seeing these incredibly high wet bulb temperatures, but we are now, not just indoors, but outdoors as well. And it's something that we're going to have to learn to live with moving forward. I don't see it going any lower any sooner. I see more and more occurrences of this, and we're going to have to understand it and know how to work within that those parameters.
Yeah. Can you imagine if every thermostat had dry bulb and wet bulb on it?
I have been waiting for a wet bulb thermostat forever. Yes.
I mean, it truly is your comfort. Like, it's not dry bulb. It's wet bulb.
So right now you have thermostats that will give you the dry bulb and the wet bulb, or the dry bulb and the humidity. And then you can go to the psychrometric chart and you
calculate it yourself.
Right. I'm waiting for the thermostat that does it. Yes.
Okay.
Or dew point even too.
Sure. Thermostat manufacturers, we're speaking. Hopefully you're listening. All right, are there any questions out there? I know that's a lot of information. Jason, I really am so grateful that you brought this up. I never even thought about it. Jason called me so excited. He's like, dude, we got to do a show on this. I'm thinking about it so much different than I ever have in the past, and we have to go this way.
There is just so much focus, again, on dry bulb and not enough on the wet bulb. And it's the wet bulb that affects us more than the dry bulb itself.
Well, and it completely, it's directly related to human comfort and sustainability. Yeah, that's why we're doing this, Sam. This is so
that would be in the no exercise.
Yeah,
permitted.
this is the one. Don't move. No, so probably 15 years ago or so, I was in an attic working, but it wasn't quite in the summer. Right, it was late spring, but it had rained. It was very humid. I was in an attic doing some work, and I started feeling really, really, really bad. And I didn't know what was going on. Fortunately, I was less than a mile from my local hospital. I drove myself over there, and I was having heat exhaustion. And I said, well, it's not really that hot out. I've been in worse scenarios than this. I've been in hotter scenarios than this and did just fine. And they didn't have an explanation. And sadly, now that I look back about it, if I would have taken a wet bulb measurement of the space that I was in, I would have understood why in that lower outdoor temperature, I was having such a difficult time breathing and moving.
This will help you calculate your own limits. Again, when you're looking at that 140 degree attic, throw a wet bulb up there and see what it is. You should know you probably shouldn't be up there 2-3 hours at a time. I mean, you have to limit your time up and down and water intake in those situations.
Exactly. Osvaldo, yeah, because I think, aren't you in Belize, if I remember right? Yeah, so you get those warm ocean conditions and high temperature. Yeah, this is the reason it's uncomfortable near the coast when it's 90 once the humidity goes up.
We get that evaporation, we get the moisture into the air, and it raises the wet bulb. So just think of wet bulb as the lowest temperature your body could cool to through sweating. I mean, those are directly related. If the wet bulb is 95, that means your body can't cool any lower. There's no heat exchange happening there at all.
Exactly. Man, what a topic, Jason.
I hope everyone takes something away from it.
I do.
Think a little deeper on wet bulb when you're teaching it or calculate, or your own work conditions when you're going to go into that 140 degree attic. Take a little psychrometer up there and take the wet bulb and see, all right, I probably shouldn't be working up here like this for this long.
That's right. Yeah. So here's the challenge, Osvaldo. Measure wet bulb. Get back to us on the next show.
For real. I'm curious. Yes.
I am as well. All right, everyone. Well, we thank you so much for joining us. It's a great conversation. Next week, we're going to spend some time with Inficon. We're going to dive into changes in refrigerant and gas leak detection now that we're working with A1, A2L, and even in some cases A3 refrigerants, knowing what are the right detectors and what are those detectors even measuring. It's going to be a great conversation. So I thank you all for joining us. We'll see you all next week on Did You Know? The ESCO HVAC Show. Bye, everybody.